Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Machiavelli's book, The Prince. Now let's give some context for the book. Machiavelli was a minister in the Republic of Florence. The Republic of Florence was a brief political entity that existed during the 1500s when the Medici family were out of power. So normally Florence wasn't a republic, but at this time, at least briefly, it was. Now, Machiavelli's regime was defeated by forces led by the Pope. And Machiavelli wasn't just fired from his job, but he was also tortured before being released. Now, in this book, he is at least possibly trying to regain favor with the new ruling family of Florence, and in particular Duke Lorenzo de' Medici. There's another school of thought on this subject, and I think this is the more popular one these days, which suggests that he might be satirizing the Medici regime. Really, what he's written here is a critique of the way the Medici do politics. Scholars, in any way, differ on the subject. Now, Niccolo Machiavelli the man, whatever his intentions, was no woolly-headed philosopher. He was a historian, a statesman, a diplomat, a spy, and a military strategist. He was someone with a lot of practical experience of government, although that experience wasn't always particularly successful. Putting Machiavelli next to Socrates and Aristotle reveals several glaring contrasts worth exploring, and I'm going to outline them on this slide, and we'll go into each of them in detail as we move on in the lecture. Ideal versus non-ideal theory, reason versus experience, truth versus appearances, the role of fortune in politics, and the importance of character versus the importance of results. Now, Plato is perhaps the most idealist of all the ideal theorists. This means that he articulates an ideal polity in the Republic that he hopes people can approximate or put into practice. Socrates, in Plato's dialogues, is also a little bit of an idealist. He sets an example by trying to always do the right thing, even when it comes at great personal cost. Machiavelli, on the other hand, tries to highlight all of the constraints that decision makers face. These constraints can include domestic constraints, that is to say, the individual histories and institutions that a ruler might inherit within a polity, the constraints that are embodied by our human nature, our flaws in reasoning and rationality, and the constraints that are embodied by the international context in which a state operates. And this is something that's almost entirely absent from Plato and Aristotle, the notion that other states exercise influence on your state, and international constraints may limit what a statesman can do, and indeed may influence what a statesman should do. Now, I think it's easy to present ideal and non-ideal theory as opposite approaches to political philosophy. Ideal theorists, by and large, ignore feasibility constraints, while non-ideal theorists try to give us advice given the particular limitations of our situation. But I think there's another way in which you might also think of ideal theory and non-ideal as complementary. I want to imagine that you're besieged by enemies, external and internal, on all sides, and your resources are running out, and you're looking for a guide on what you should do. I think, under those circumstances, Machiavelli is going to seem quite useful. But now imagine that all your enemies are defeated and pushed back, at least for now, and your treasury is brimming, full of gold. You have some breathing space. Where should you go from here? Well, I think under those circumstances, I think Plato or Aristotle are probably your more likely guides to a better future. So these aren't just different approaches to theorizing, but I think they might be attempts to answer different sorts of questions, both of which we have a need to answer. For example, should we give in to blackmail? Should we lie to corrupt authorities? When should we disobey the law? Given that everyone else is likely to act selfishly, how should I behave in potentially cooperative situations? I think these are all the kinds of questions that are raised by non-ideal theorists. On the other hand, what kind of government is best? What kinds of habits and dispositions are best for living together in a community? What generates political authority? What is perfect justice? I think these kinds of questions are the ones most often raised by ideal theorists, and I think political theory has room for both sorts of questions. A second area where I think the contrast is apparent between Aristotle and Plato on the one hand and Machiavelli on the other is on the role that reason plays, and reason and principle in particular play in guiding our understanding of both politics and principle more generally. Aristotle and Plato love to emphasize logical deduction from first principles, right? They articulate some general principles, some general ideas about justice, and they try to work out what that means by working out further and further and more specific principles, again, through logical deduction. I think Machiavelli is more steeped in the lessons of experience. Machiavelli's methodology is not to look to first principles and inquire about what justice is, but to look to history, to see what other people have done, and to see what's been successful and what's not been successful. So I think Socrates is the archetype of the philosopher who challenges conventional wisdom. He walks around Athens asking people questions and discovers that on the whole, most people don't know what they're talking about, they don't know what they think they know, and many seem quite foolish. And what's worse, they're unaware that they're foolish. And Plato's reaction to Socrates' experience is to reject all the nonsense that people apparently believed and try to rebuild with more solid foundations, using reason, using first principles, and using a little bit of common sense. In other words, if it doesn't make sense, Plato says, throw it out. I think Machiavelli takes a different tack. Machiavelli leans heavily on history and the experience of great leaders to discover what statesmen should do. When he theorizes, he does so by trying to draw lessons from examples, not by trying to recreate philosophy from first principles. He worries a lot about how influential actors will respond to the proposed changes in laws and habits. Plato seems to hope that he can persuade people of what justice is and what's right and get them to do the right thing. Of course, that didn't really go so well for Socrates, but Machiavelli thinks we should just take people as they are and make sure that whatever we do, it's compatible with their expectations and their reactions. On the whole, it looks like Machiavelli wants us to trust the wisdom of accumulated experience in political matters. And it doesn't always have to make sense, and it certainly doesn't have to make sense in light of our principles of justice or the lights of our own reason. It just has to work. I think, once again, this is an example of Machiavelli focusing on the constraints people face. But in this case, the constraints are the limitations the limitations on our own private stock of knowledge and reason. That is to say, each of us is very limited in our perspective, in our reasoning abilities, and so we're limited. We can't just rely, if we rely on ourselves only and our own reason, we're likely to make a lot of mistakes. So Machiavelli is perfectly aware that decision makers operate under circumstances of very limited knowledge and limited rationality. And so we can't fully trust our faculties of reason. So what are we to do? Well, I think Machiavelli shows you what to do, which is look at history, read widely about the experiences of others, and try to make inferences based on the experiences gone through the other people have gone through. In other words, we have a whole world of history at our fingertips. We should use that, not just our own experiences, to make decisions about what to do. So history needs to be our guide rather than reason or abstract principle. In fact, rigid adherence to principle is likely to lead to bad outcomes for Machiavelli. It will impede the agility and flexibility that's required to adjust to the changing circumstances of politics. So far from being a guide, political principle can be quite dangerous. A third area of contrast concerns truth and appearances. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are all laser focused on one goal: discovering the truth. What's the truth about justice? What's the truth about the best form of political organization? What's the truth about the best life that human beings can live? Machiavelli, by contrast, I think is much more focused on appearances. What matters in politics, Machiavelli thinks, is not how things are, but how they look, and especially how they look to those people with power and influence who can make life difficult for you. Surviving and thriving in the nasty business of real-world politics, at least in 16th century Italy, requires putting the truth about things like justice and morality way to the side and focusing on appearances. I think one way to make sense of Machiavelli is to say that questions of justice or right and wrong have no place in politics. I'm not sure that's right, but that's certainly one interpretation that can be given to Machiavelli, is that he's completely amoral. Questions of justice just don't matter in politics. I think a different way to think about Machiavelli could be to say that the circumstances of politics create a different set of standards for those who partake in politics. That is to say, the circumstances dictate behavior and what we should do, not just abstract principles of right and wrong. And that these circumstances, these principles of politics, as opposed to principles of morality, are no less moral and no less true than the ideals of the ancients. But they end up counseling opposite kinds of behavior for statesmen and ordinary citizens. That is to say, they end up saying, given the circumstances that we're in, the flawed circumstances of politics, particularly international politics, being good and being just, whatever those things are, is likely to be a bad guide to your behavior. And in fact, Machiavelli clearly says those who are good and keep faith, that is to say, keep their agreements when everybody else is not doing so, are going to come to a bad end. So one analogy that I think is helpful to understand where Machiavelli is coming from here is to think about the fact that every practice has its own rules of ethics. That is to say, has its own norms and expectations. So for example, think of boxing or hockey. In those sports, it's perfectly okay to hit people, at least some of the time, and in some places. And in other sports, like basketball and volleyball, these are supposed to be sports where you can't just go ahead and hit people. So you have common sense principles like don't hit people are not very helpful for dealing with situations like boxing or hockey. In fact, in boxing or hockey, you'd be wrong not to hit people. You're going to lose if you do that. You'd be a bad hockey player and a bad boxer if you avoided physical contact all the time. Okay. Now, how does this relate to politics? Well, politics, Machiavelli thinks of, is just a different context. And the context dictates what makes playing the game or what makes successful players of the game. And in politics, successful players of the game have to lie, have to cheat, have to betray. That's what it means to play the game well. In everyday life, though, you probably shouldn't. In everyday life, with your family, winning the game in your community and in your family probably means not lying and not cheating and not betraying. And so Machiavelli is just saying, look, the context dictates what's right and wrong. There's no ultimate abstract principle to appeal to. It's just a question of what leads to success in each of these domains. Okay. A fourth contrast, the rule of fortune. Plato and Aristotle write sometimes as if states and people can be controlled, like chess pieces on a game board. Just set up the right institutions and good things will happen. So arrange people, both internally and externally, that is to say, arrange people's character, right? Both Plato and Aristotle are very concerned about your character. And of course, externally, the institutions and the rules by which governments operate. If you just do that, then you're going to have the ideal polity. End of story. For Machiavelli, politics and life are less like chess, where you control the disposition of every piece, and more like poker. A substantial element of good and bad fortune is going to influence the outcome of any given hand in poker, not just the skill of the players. Yes, over time, better players tend to win in poker, and worse players tend to lose, but in any given hand, there are definitely certain cases where even the best of players is not going to be able to overcome the disadvantage of a terrible hand. The key skills for Machiavelli, therefore, are to be able to prepare and react to the cards that you're dealt. In other words, fortune deals you good and bad hands. The best you can do is prepare to react and be agile and nimble in the face of good and bad fortune. Take advantage of good fortune, ride out the bad fortune as best you can. But Machiavelli seems to be very attuned to the fact that a lot of things in politics are out of our hands, and I think Plato and Aristotle generally don't see politics that way. One more thing on the role of fortune. Now, I do think that Plato and Aristotle do think about fortune especially when you're thinking about whether a person ends up happy in life or not. And I think Aristotle in Nicomachean Ethics and Plato in a couple different places certainly acknowledge that whether or not you are able to exercise your virtue, whether or not you live a good life or not, that might be subject to fortune. But again, in the realm of politics, fortune seems to be downplayed. And I think Machiavelli, again, the role of randomness and good and bad luck plays a much larger role. Okay, so in conclusion, Machiavelli is twice as close to us in time than he was to Plato. Machiavelli is about 500-600 years away from us and about 1,000 years away from Plato and Aristotle. But the prince seems to be implicitly and explicitly set up as a foil to the kind of thinking done by Plato and Aristotle. In other words, although they're separated by 1,000 years or maybe 900 years, Machiavelli, I think, at least indirectly and probably directly, given how well read he is, classically speaking, is speaking to Plato and Aristotle and the people who, in his day and age, were looking to Plato and Aristotle for guidance about politics. And although the foil may be satirical in some ways, what's interesting to me is that modern audiences, sort of incarnated by my students, often find the prince much more interesting and relevant than either Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics. What that says about our modern audiences, though, I'm not entirely sure.